The sinking of the RMS Titanic on April 15, 1912 was a monumental disaster, claiming the lives of 1,517 passengers in the frigid Atlantic Ocean. It's since been elevated to one of those moments in history that feels more legendary than real, because it's hard to fathom how such a terrible disaster ever took place. That epic status has led to countless misconceptions being repeated again and again as absolute fact. So let's try to separate fact from fiction. Lifeboat lies. Let's start with one of the biggest mistakes people make when they think of the Titanic. The myth that there weren't enough lifeboats for all of its passengers because the White Star Line was run by greedy corporate jerks who didn't think the ship would sink anyway. The idea is that they cut corners on safety because who wants to spend money on lifeboats for an unsinkable ship? In actuality, the White Star Line had gone above and beyond the legal requirements for the number of lifeboats on the Titanic. At the time she was built, Titanic was bound by the laws that had been put in place at the end of the 19th century, which declared the number of lifeboats on a vessel should be based on the ship's gross tonnage, not the number of passengers it was carrying. Since Titanic's weight was 46,000 tons, the ship was only required to have lifeboats that could safely hold 1,060 people. Titanic exceeded that by providing enough lifeboats to fit 1,178 people. Perhaps not comfortably, but still. It was only after the Titanic sank that both the British and American governments took a good hard look at the regulations, and the British Commissioner lodged an official recommendation that the number of lifeboats be based on the number of people on board the ship rather than a weight. World record. It's often repeated that the crew of the Titanic weren't just crossing the Atlantic, but they were trying to do it in record time to win the Blue Ribbon.
The prisoner's the size of Titanic. Now I want them to marvel at her speed. We must give them something new to print.
But Titanic wasn't trying to set a speed record at all, and we know that because when she hit the iceberg, and for much of the journey, all of her boilers hadn't even been lit. Also, the route she was taking wasn't right for a race anyway. By the time she set sail, they were well-defined routes and shipping lanes across the Atlantic. She was following a southern route which ran in about 200 miles longer than the northern one. Besides, White Star had a strict policy of slow and steady. That was mainly to cater to their first-class passengers and to make the trip as smooth as possible, because Titanic was, first and foremost, the picture of luxury. Doom and gloom. Hindsight can be a terrible, terrible thing, and countless ill omens have been assigned to the construction of the Titanic. She was built in Belfast, and according to one rumour, the Catholic workers who laboured to build her knew she was doomed when they saw her hull number, 390904, written on pieces of the ship by hand, and then read backwards it spelled, "No Pope." It's a chilling theory and all, but it's still just a story. There's tons of evidence that this is just a fanciful tale that grew up in the aftermath of the tragedy. For one thing, Titanic was actually assigned 2 different numbers while she was being built. The Board of Trade assigned her 131428, and the number given to her by the Harland and Wolff shipyard was 401. Either way, the "no Pope" thing doesn't work, and it's doubtful that even the most devout of Belfast dock workers would have been convinced that the number predicted doom for the ship, mainly because most of them were actually Protestant. Precious cargo. Another myth that often crops up when people start looking for a reason for what happened is that the Titanic was carrying some kind of Egyptian mummy and a curse, or that she was weighed down with a gold bullion. Neither of these things were true though. The mummy legend was first written by a London journalist named William Thomas Stead, who wrote a story about a mummy that had been removed from her tomb in Egypt and taken to London, where she brought destruction to everyone in her path. Stead linked the story to a very real mummy that sat in the British Museum, belonging to a priestess of Amun. So when Stead suggested that the mummy was a cursing machine, people ran with it, and when he later died on the Titanic, the mummy legend became linked with the sinking ship. But the mummy in question still rests peacefully in the museum, so that's one myth busted. There was also no gold bullion on the Titanic, and we know this particularly because we have the cargo manifests, partially because no claim was ever issued, and partially because the ship that was actually carrying that gold was the HMS Laurentic, another White Star ship that came out of the same shipyard as Titanic and sank in 1917 with the metal on board. Sure, it was a bad few years for White Star, but the gold curse wasn't on Titanic. Bubbly break. Another legend that's made the rounds is that when Titanic was launched and christened, the champagne bottle smashed against her hull didn't break. It's thought to be bad luck when that happens, and a sunken ship killing thousands is pretty much the definition of bad luck. Thing is, no champagne bottle was ever broken or not broken on Titanic's hull, because White Star never did the launching ceremony with any of their ships. The process of getting the ship out of dry dock and into water is impressively complicated enough, and White Star apparently didn't buy into any pomp and circumstance or care about appeasing any ocean gods. Of course, given their track record, maybe they should have. Cross-dressing salvation. Another rumor that's held water over the years is that one male passenger dressed up as a woman to secure a seat on a lifeboat. Not only is this one not true, but it ruined the life of a man who was said to have done it. According to William T. Sloper, he escaped in a lifeboat because he was simply in the right place at the right time. There weren't enough women and children to fill the lifeboats, so whoever was there got in and launched. Other eyewitnesses' reports verify that that's exactly what happened, except for tabloid pioneer William Hearst, who never let the truth get in the way of a sensational story that would sell more papers. His journalists ran another story claiming that Sloper had disguised himself as a woman to get on board. Sloper could never live it down and was called Skirts for the rest of his life. He even had to build a wall around his house to keep the curiosity seekers away, and the whole thing seemed to add insult to injury. This only proves that something doesn't have to be the truth to be repeated as such. And while we're on that subject, Captain Cook. Let's talk about the sad tale of the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith. There's a whole lot of stories about him and how he contributed to the disaster, from pushing for the speed record we've already debunked to ignoring warnings about icebergs. Smith didn't ignore iceberg warnings, he had them all posted in the chart room. He's often accused of having failed his navigation test, and that one, at least, is true. While yes, he failed once upon a time, he eventually passed the test with flying colours in 1888. After that, he went on to be a successful captain. He was called the Millionaire's Captain because he was so good at his job that most anyone who could afford to request a certain captain chose him. As for the stories that he committed suicide before the ship sank, it's uncertain as to how he spent his last moments, but some of the final eyewitness reports of his activities place him on the bridge about 7 minutes before the ship sank, meaning that however he died, we know that he did choose to go down with his ship. Sent to steerage. As myth and the movie would have it, third-class passengers were locked below while first-class passengers boarded their lifeboats. And when you look at the numbers, it seems logical that this horrible fact would be true. While the majority of first-class passengers survived, including a third of the men and almost all the women and children, most of the third-class passengers died. Popular belief dictates that poorer people were locked below to save the lifeboats for the rich, but it's not exactly true. Survivor testimonies like the one from Irishman Daniel Buckley, who resided in the third-class cabins, contest this theory. Women and children. We've all heard that the Titanic set a chivalrous precedent when it came to loading up its lifeboats.
Women and children first.
In truth, it wasn't a strict rule on the boats, and really hasn't been much of a thing since, but the practice of selective salvation did have a hand in who got a raft seat and who didn't. There were two different men managing the lifeboats on each side of the Titanic. On the left, life rafts were overseen by Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who took the captain's orders seriously, and as a result, there were almost no male passengers saved on his side. On the right was First Officer William Murdoch, who was in charge. He took a slightly different approach, which was still to put women and children on first. However, if there were no more waiting and ready to go, the men were ushered on. In the end, Murdoch and his flexible interpretation saved 62 more lives. In the ship's final moments, Lightoller jumped into the water and was the last survivor, picked up by the Carpathia. Murdoch's body, meanwhile, was never recovered. The idea of women and children first was around before Titanic, but it was the shipwreck that firmly entrenched the idea into maritime law. So how have we done since then? In a study of 18 shipwrecks and 15,000 passengers involved, children had only about a 15% chance of surviving. Adult men, twice as likely to live as their female counterparts. Titanic was an exception in another bit of maritime law too, as her captain died with her. Look at those same 18 wrecks and you'll find that the captain and crew had a 61% chance of seeing the sun rise, while their male passengers only had a 37% chance. So yeah, happy sailing everybody.
The sinking of the Titanic was a terrible disaster, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 people. But the story is even worse than the numbers suggest. Here's why the death toll isn't the most disturbing part of the Titanic sinking. It's probably safe to say that the Titanic's designers didn't do much reading of popular fiction. If they had, they might have picked up a little piece of literature entitled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Although it was a work of fiction released 14 years before the launch of the real-life ship, Futility contains some seriously eerie similarities to the story of the Titanic. The fictional Titan is described as the largest craft afloat, equal to that of a first-class hotel, and unsinkable. Sounds familiar.
So this is the ship they say is unsinkable.
It is unsinkable. God himself could not sink this ship.
But the similarities don't stop there. Like the Titanic, the fictional Titan was about 400 nautical miles away from Newfoundland on a voyage in April when, at close to midnight, it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. And like the Titanic, the Titan didn't have enough lifeboats for everybody on board. We probably don't have to point out the similarity of the names. It's just a bizarre coincidence, so much so that after the Titanic sank, people began accusing author Morgan Robertson of being some kind of clairvoyant, which he denied. But he did try to cash in on publicity from the disaster, with the book being republished in 1912 with some minor changes and the new Wreck of the Titan title. We'd say too soon, but apparently he came up with it first. The Titanic wasn't the first ship in history to use the SOS distress call, but in 1912, wireless communication was still pretty new, which meant there weren't really any standards regarding monitoring the airwaves. That explains why no one on board the Californian, a ship which was somewhere between 8 and 12 miles away from the Titanic, heard the sinking ship's distress calls. At the time that the Titanic hit the iceberg, the Californian had only one wireless operator, and he'd switched off his equipment and gone to bed.
That's it for me. I'm shutting down.
If he hadn't, he would have known that the Titanic was in trouble within about 15 minutes of the collision when the first distress call was sent. At the time that the Titanic was sinking, the Californian was surrounded by ice and stopped for the night. If the ship had received the SOS call and left immediately, it probably would have taken 30 minutes to get through the ice and another 30 to 60 minutes to reach the Titanic. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to actually sink, so the crew of the Californian would have had more than an hour to collect passengers. They might have even been able to save everyone, but that's not what happened. Making things more tragic, the Californian's crew did see the Titanic's distress rockets, but the captain dismissed them as non-emergency signals meant for some other boat. By the time the Californian turned the radio on the next morning, there was nothing left of the Titanic but bodies floating in the sea. The Titanic wasn't floating blindly through the North Atlantic when it hit the giant iceberg, so why didn't the ship just go around? One theory says the sea was too calm and the two lookouts in the crow's nest weren't able to see waves breaking at the iceberg's base. According to another theory, the crow's nest didn't have any binoculars. Except that one isn't really a theory, it's really an unfortunate fact. Let's get this straight. The Titanic had rowing machines, an electric horse, a squash court, and a heated swimming pool, but it didn't have a pair of binoculars on board? Well, it did, but at the time the ship struck the iceberg, they were unhelpfully locked away in a cabinet, and no one could find the key. That key was back in England in the pocket of a crew member who had disembarked the ship.
Whoopsie-daisy.
That crew member was David Blair, who served as the Titanic's second officer between the ports of Belfast and Southampton. But before the ship's maiden voyage to New York, the White Star Line decided to replace him at the last minute. In his rush to disembark, he forgot to give the key to his replacement, a mistake that potentially doomed more than 1,500 people. Before the Titanic left, Blair sent a postcard to his sister-in-law in which he wrote in part, "This is a magnificent ship, and I feel very disappointed I'm not going to make her first voyage." Imagine how disappointed his crewmates felt when they couldn't find that key. Every life lost on the Titanic was a tragedy, from third-class Jack to first-class Rose, except Rose didn't actually die, and Oh, yeah, they're fictional. But even though all the real-life stories are devastating, some are harder to read than others. One especially awful story is about Ramon Artagavetia, who survived the sinking of a ship called the America, which sank off the coast of Uruguay in 1871. According to his own letters, Ramon may have suffered from PTSD after his first shipwreck experience, which is pretty understandable. But if you've already lived through one shipwreck, the worst has gotta be behind you. It couldn't happen again, right?
It happened again.
After years of anxiety, Ramon wrote to a cousin about his faith in the Titanic, with words that now read as tragically ironic. "At last I will be able to travel, and above all, I will be able to sleep calm." Ramon died in the disaster, and his body was recovered about a week after the sinking. Once the disaster started to take hold, nobody could really have saved everyone on the Titanic, but there were plenty of acts of heroism on that fateful night. One underpublicized act of heroism is the sacrifice of the ship's engineers. There were 35 of them on board the Titanic, but despite that large crew number, we have no first-hand accounts of what they were actually doing during the ship's final moments. That's because they all died.
Go to maximum more! Push it! I'm giving it all she's got, Captain!
Here's what we do know. While the ship was going down, the engineering team stayed at their post and kept the lights on. That's a bigger deal than it might sound like it is. Remember, this was in the middle of the North Atlantic on a night without a full moon. Beyond the ship's own lighting, there was just darkness in the sea. The electric lights made it possible for the crew to load the lifeboats and keep passengers from panicking. Power also made it possible for the radio operators to continue transmitting distress signals. Even though their efforts didn't save the ship, their sacrifice doubtlessly helped save many lives. It's hard to believe that one meager iceberg could take down the biggest thing in the ocean with just a glancing blow. And until the wreckage of the ship was discovered in 1985, people could only speculate about the exact nature of the Titanic's vulnerability. For a while, researchers wondered if the Titanic might have been built out of low-quality steel, but that theory was disproven when large pieces of the ship were recovered and tested. Sonar mapping of the side that struck the iceberg revealed only 6 thin tears in the hull, which would have left roughly 12 square feet open to the sea. That by itself wouldn't have been enough to sink a ship like the Titanic, which had 16 watertight compartments. So what happened? In 1998, an analysis was conducted on the rivets of the ship's wreckage, which found that the wrought iron contained 3 times as much slag as modern standards allow for. That's very interesting, but what is slag?
Kill me, you slag!
In case you're not a blacksmith, shipbuilder, or rivet maker, slag is the glass-like residue left behind by metal ore after the smelting process. According to the theory, all that extra slag used in the rivets made them brittle in cold temperatures, so the iceberg just sheared off the heads as it scraped along the side of the ship. When that happened, the rivets came loose, the hull plate separated, and water came rushing in. So basically, the Titanic's shipbuilders seem to have cut some crucial corners leading to dire consequences. This can happen when you rush things. When it comes to most projects, you can do something fast or you can do it right. The builders behind the Titanic apparently chose the fast option, and it shows. 4 days after the disaster, the Boston Globe declared all drowned but 868. But there are 2 inaccurate things about that headline. The first problem is the number of survivors, which was actually closer to about 700. The second was the manner of death. While the sinking of the Titanic claimed many victims, not everyone who lost their lives in the disaster died by drowning. The Titanic didn't really have that many drowning victims, at least not as many as you would think. Those who remained in the ship probably drowned as the Titanic sank and the ship's breathable air was displaced, but those who jumped into the water were mostly wearing life preservers, making them much less likely to drown. There's also the fact that the survivors who were safely in the lifeboats later reported hearing the awful din kicked up by those in the water, suggesting that most of the people floating around the boats weren't drowning. Drowning is a thing that happens silently. People who are in the middle of it typically can't call out for help. What really worked to kill so many people was freezing. The seawater in the North Atlantic was only 28 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of the Titanic sinking, which is 4 degrees below the freezing temperature of fresh water. That's more than cold enough to damage the human body. It's possible that as people lost consciousness from the cold temperature, they inhaled water, which hastened their deaths. But that's not drowning as we understand it. It's drowning as a side effect of being incapacitated by hypothermia. If the ship crashed in the Caribbean in some 80-degree water, lots more people may have made it back to shore alive. But if that was the case, it probably wouldn't have hit an iceberg either. If anything, it maybe would have hit a Carnival cruise ship, or the Bermuda Triangle, or maybe some of these guys. Look, the seven seas can be a really crazy place. Imagine that it's the spring of 1912 and you're still reeling from the death of a loved one who went down with the Titanic. Maybe they were one of the people who rather grandly played in the ship's band, providing musical comfort to doomed passengers as the ship slowly sank. You miss your father, your brother, your son, and then you get billed for his uniform.
Fuck.
This is something that actually happened. While it may not be as disturbing as some of the other things we know about the Titanic, it's a pretty ugly footnote. One example of this happening can be found in the story of musician John Hume, who was booked on the Titanic through a firm called C.W. and F.N. Black. 2 weeks after the sinking, Hume's father received a bill for his son's uniform, which included items like his lapel pin and white star buttons. The bill amounted to 14 shillings and 7 pence, and that's before you count the insult of even getting a bill at all. Okay, so if you spilled mustard on your uniform because you were eating a messy burger in your off time, maybe you had that bill coming. But the Titanic's dead musicians weren't responsible for the destruction of their uniforms, and the dead musicians' parents definitely weren't responsible.
In a way that's deeply capitalist.
Anyway, Hume's dad refused to pay and sent the letter to the Amalgamated Musicians Union, who published the outrageous demand in their newsletter. So now you know that even if you're a victim of a Titanic-scale disaster, some companies will still try to get money from you literally over your dead body. The sinking of the RMS Titanic is one of the most famous stories in maritime history, thanks in part to James Cameron's iconic 1997 movie. The RMS Titanic was a luxurious steamship that boasted top-of-the-range facilities, decked with fine furniture and state-of-the-art equipment for the time. The second and third class accommodations weren't bad either, and provided entertainment areas and comfortable rooms for those who couldn't afford first-class tickets. But just before midnight on April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg. It tore into the side of the ship, causing seawater to flood into 6 of its 16 watertight compartments. Just a few hours later, the Titanic was swallowed by the ocean, finally going down in the early morning of April 15th. The Titanic had a total of 20 lifeboats on board, more than the required number by the Board of Trade, but definitely not enough to rescue all the passengers and crew. The ship had approximately 2,200 people on board when it sank, and those 20 lifeboats could only carry 1,178 people. To add to that, the evacuation was hasty and disorganized due to panic, and some lifeboats were released without even reaching full capacity. All in all, only 705 people were able to escape the sinking ship. The rest died in the frigid waters of the Atlantic, while others went down with the Titanic when it sank to the bottom of the ocean.
The whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful.
The CS Mackay Bennett from Halifax, Nova Scotia was tasked to retrieve dead bodies following the sinking. Halifax was the major port closest to the location of Titanic's sinking, and even then it took 4 days for the ship to reach the site. The Mackay Bennett was loaded with ice, wooden coffins, and embalming fluid. The ship's captain, Frederick Harold Larnder, described the scene and said that the bodies looked, quote, like a flock of seagulls. The Mackay Bennett spent a week searching the site and surrounding areas for bodies. After considerable effort, they were able to recover 306 victims. 3 other ships from Halifax were sent to the site, and they were able to recover 22 additional bodies, while other steamers that just happened to pass by the site recovered 5 more. The rescue ship Carpathia recovered 4. Of the 300-plus bodies recovered, 119 were buried at sea. This is because they had been found after the embalming fluid ran out, while other bodies were beyond recognition. These bodies were wrapped in cloth and then strapped to weights to make them sink to the bottom of the ocean. Roughly 1,500 people died when the Titanic sank, and of that number, approximately 1,160 bodies were never recovered, making the vast ocean their final resting place. After the recovery efforts, the ships containing the dead bodies docked at Halifax. Curious onlookers were gathered at the docks to watch as the bodies were transported from the ship to the waterfront. Halifax had been chosen as the location best suitable for bringing the dead, as the bodies could easily be transported from that location to other cities by train or ship if needed. Halifax mourned the loss of lives by putting black crepe in windows and flying flags at half-mast. Of the bodies that were recovered, 150 were buried in 3 different cemeteries in Halifax. Those who were identified were given headstones by their families, while unidentified victims had simple headstones saying they died on the Titanic. More than 25% of those buried in Halifax remain nameless, but that doesn't stop locals from offering tributes by leaving items on their graves. Attempts have been made to identify some of these victims, however. In 2019, Titanic expert Bill Willard attempted to test the remains of the unknown individuals in order to finally identify them. While the British Titanic Society approved the proposal, some graveyard authorities where victims are buried refused the test, saying that the dead should be left to rest in peace. Previous to that, in 2001, the so-called unknown child had been identified as Sidney Goodwin, who was just 19 months old when the Titanic sank. The sinking of the Titanic is a story of great loss and hubris, but for some, it was a tale of extraordinary survival. These are some of the most notable people who survived the fateful voyage and the lives they led after the wreck. Jack Thayer was 17 when he was separated from his parents during the chaos, and he remained on board the Titanic until almost the very end. As the ship sank beneath the waves, Thayer jumped into the cold water and eventually ended up near an overturned lifeboat. Some men helped him climb on, and he was later picked up by the passengers of another lifeboat. Thayer's mother survived too, but his father did not. Thayer went on to marry and have 6 children, but he never talked about the Titanic. He became a banker and seemed to have a pretty happy life, though he avoided boats. But he couldn't ignore his memories forever, and as his kids started to approach the age he'd been when he boarded the doomed liner, he decided to write an account of the sinking for his family. After that, he became anxious and unsettled by his memories. Then, in 1943, Thayer's 22-year-old son was killed when his plane crashed into the Pacific Ocean, a fate that was so similar to his own ordeal that it haunted him. 6 months later, Thayer's mother died just one day before the 32nd anniversary of the sinking. The two losses triggered a nervous breakdown and prolonged depression, and Thayer committed suicide on September 18, 1945. One of the Titanic's most famous passengers was John Jacob Astor IV, a wealthy financier who was traveling first class with his 18-year-old pregnant wife, Madeline. In the early moments after the collision, Astor scoffed at the idea of getting on a lifeboat, but by 1:45 a.m. he changed his mind. Helping Madeline into a lifeboat and then standing alone after he was told he couldn't join her, he ultimately died with the sinking of the ship. Madeline, though, survived and became a fabulously wealthy widow at the age of 18. But her wealth came with a cruel caveat. To keep all of Astor's money, she would need to remain unwed for the rest of her life. Madeline stayed single for a little while, but eventually love got the better of her. She chose to forego the fortune so she could marry a childhood friend. Her second husband wasn't exactly poor though, and she lived comfortably until 1932 when she embarked on a sordid affair with an Italian prizefighter. The couple married a year later even though they were both already married and even though he frequently abused her. By 1937, she was finally rid of him, but she gave him $150,000 when they parted. He thanked her by selling the story of their tumultuous marriage to a tabloid. Madeline died in 1940, reportedly of drug-induced heart failure. We know a lot about the fate of the Titanic's first-class passengers. Less is known about the people traveling in second and third class. We do know they fared poorly in the disaster. 76% of third-class passengers died in the sinking versus 58% of those traveling in second class and just 39% of those in first class. Michel and Edmond Navratil were second-class passengers, and they were also abductees. Their French father was taking them to America without their mother's knowledge, and they were traveling under false names. After the ship struck the iceberg, their dad loaded the boys, ages 2 and 4, into a lifeboat and then went down with the ship. The boys then anonymously boarded the Carpathia, a ship that came to the rescue. They were the only surviving children who weren't accompanied by at least one parent or adult guardian. They didn't speak English either, so they weren't able to tell authorities who they were. Even after authorities found someone to translate, neither one of the boys would answer questions with anything other than "oui." Finally, the boys' mother saw a photograph of them in a newspaper and identified them. She had no idea they'd even been on board the Titanic. They were reunited and returned to France, where they remained for the rest of their lives. Edmond died in his early 40s, but Michel lived to be 92. It takes a special sort of personality to emerge from a disaster not just unscathed, but also so unaffected that you immediately make plans to profit from the experience. This particular person was Dorothy Gibson, the silent film star who was traveling home from a Paris vacation when the Titanic struck the iceberg. Gibson boarded a lifeboat and she was saved along with her mother and a couple of acquaintances. Almost immediately after arriving in New York, Gibson started shooting the movie Saved from the Titanic. It was a dramatized account of the sinking in which she wore the same outfit she'd worn on the night of the disaster. She basically played a much more heroic version of herself. After filming Wrapped, she married film pioneer Jules Brulator, but they divorced by 1919. Gibson moved to Paris and ended up in Florence, Italy during the worst years of World War II. In 1943, she was arrested and taken to a Nazi concentration camp, eventually ending up imprisoned at San Vittore. She likely would have died there, but she styled herself as a Nazi sympathizer and spy. She was ultimately smuggled out by a double agent. After the war, Gibson briefly moved into the Paris Ritz and later died in February 1946. A shipwreck is an awful experience, even if you survive it. A lot of Titanic survivors were apprehensive about, if not downright adverse to, ever boarding a ship again. But there were a couple of passengers who proved resilient to the trauma, and one of those was Charles Jocelyn, the ship's baker. Jocelyn's survival is a bit of a mystery because, by his own account, he floated in the water for more than 2 hours before he was helped on board a lifeboat. The secret to his survival? He was really drunk. Well, that's the legend anyway. After his ordeal, Jocelyn remained a ship's baker, and the Titanic wasn't his last shipwreck either. In 1916, he was serving on a ship called the SS Congress when it caught fire. Then in 1941, the ship he was serving on was accidentally rammed by another ship, and in between all those disasters, he served on other boats, so being in shipwrecks didn't seem to faze him. He died in 1956, not at sea, but in a hospital. The officers on board the Titanic took the women and children first guideline so seriously that in some cases it was women and children only.
For the time being, I shall require only women and children.
Some of the boats launched half empty because there weren't enough women and children willing to leave the imagined safety of the ship for a tiny lifeboat. As a result, some of the male survivors weren't treated especially well. Take Masabumi Hosono, the only Japanese citizen to survive the sinking. The officer loading the boats near where Hosono was standing announced that there were 2 seats left, and Hosono was one of 2 men who got on board. He survived the sinking but became infamous in his home country. Hosono was shamed by the Japanese public because he'd lived while so many others had perished. His story even appeared in textbooks as an example of shameful and unethical behavior. Hosono lived until 1939, but he never recovered from the stain of his survival. His family suffered too, and for a couple of generations, the name Hosono was synonymous with shame in Japan. It wasn't until Hosono's grandchild published some of his writings that the shame finally began to lift, but sadly, it didn't happen in Hosono's lifetime. The Titanic had 2 lesser-known sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. Between the Olympic and the Titanic was billed as the largest, but it was only around 3 inches longer. As for the Britannic, it was built after the Titanic disaster, so it had all the latest safety features, but it still sank 3 times as fast as its sister did. Passenger ships need waitstaff, and one of the servants on board the Olympic was 24-year-old Violet Jessup. Jessup experienced her first accident at sea in 1911 when the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk. The ship didn't sink, though. She went on from there to survive the Titanic and then moved on to the Britannic, where she served as a nurse during World War I. Jessup also survived when the Britannic sank after striking a mine in 1916. Despite the much faster sinking, only 30 of the 1,066 people on board the Britannic perished. Undeterred, Jessup continued to work on ships, first for the White Star Line and later for the Red Star Line and the Royal Mail Line. She retired in 1950 and died in 1971 at the age of 84. A lot of people who survived the sinking of the Titanic suffered lifelong trauma. Many had survivor's guilt, but some lived with the feeling that they could have done something to prevent the whole horrible disaster. One of those people was Frederick Fleet, who spotted the iceberg from the crow's nest at around 11:40 p.m. He rang the bell and called down to the bridge, warning about an incoming iceberg.
Iceberg, right ahead!
But he wasn't fast enough, and the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship as the crew swung to port to avoid it. Fleet was ordered to row a lifeboat, which is how he managed to escape the sinking. For the rest of his life, he maintained that the tragedy could have been avoided if the crow's nest had a pair of binoculars. Fleet left the White Star Line a few months after the disaster and continued to work at sea until 1936. After that, he worked as a shipbuilder. He married and had a daughter, but after his wife died in 1964, his brother-in-law kicked him out of the home he owned that the couple had been living in. Fleet committed suicide just 2 weeks later. When you boast to the world that your ship is unsinkable and then your ship sinks, you should maybe make sure that you sink with it. At least that was a public consensus about J. Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line. He boarded the Titanic for its maiden journey and was one of only a few men to get a spot on a lifeboat. Once on board the Carpathia, Ismay insisted on a private cabin and spent the rest of the journey under the influence of opiates. When he left the Carpathia, Ismay became the subject of deep criticism. It had been his decision to limit the number of lifeboats on board the ship, and he had decided to speed through the ice field on the night of the collision. Ismay was officially cleared of wrongdoing, but his reputation never recovered. He resigned his position with the White Star Line in 1913 and then left London for self-imposed exile in Ireland. He lived in a stately manner until the early 1920s when it was burned to the ground by the Irish Republican Army. He rebuilt and lived in relative anonymity until 1937 when he died from a stroke. Collapsible Lifeboat B turned over as officers were trying to get it down from where it was stored, and at that point the Titanic was practically sunk. About 30 men, including 59-year-old first-class passenger Archibald Gracie IV, found their way to it and survived by standing on top of it. With that many people standing on it, the boat was pretty heavily weighed down, so they were all knee-deep in water. Eventually, Gracie was picked up by another lifeboat. But by the time he boarded the Carpathia, he had hypothermia. Gracie never recovered from the disaster. He died in December 1912, roughly 8 months after the sinking. He did spend his final days productively, though, as he wrote a book entitled The Truth About the Titanic, which was posthumously published in 1913.
My book will differ from the others, that having been written, presented almost entirely from the human side and given my personal experience.
One of the Titanic's most famous passengers was Molly Brown, who after the disaster became deservedly known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. After the ship struck the iceberg, Brown immediately set herself to the task of helping other people board lifeboats. She didn't try to get on one herself, and she only ended up on board when she was chucked into one unceremoniously. The boat wasn't at capacity, and she implored the man put in charge to go back and save people from the water.
Everything that was humanly possible has been done.
Once on board the Carpathia, Brown took no time out for her own recovery. She started a charity fund to help poor passengers, and she gathered blankets to give to the people who were sleeping in corridors and the dining room of the rescue ship. After disembarking in New York, Brown went on to become an outspoken advocate for causes like women's suffrage and workers' rights. She even ran for Senate. After World War I broke out, she joined the Red Cross and eventually traveled overseas to help rebuild France. She died in her sleep in 1932 at the age of 65. Third-class passenger Melvina Dean was just 2 months old when the Titanic went down. She, her mother, and her brother were among the first passengers to escape the sinking ship. Her father, who helped get them to the boat deck before the crowds arrived, did not survive. Dean had no memory of the events, and she went on to live a very long, mostly ordinary life. After the sinking, her family abandoned their plans to immigrate to Kansas and returned to England on board the RMS Adriatic. She became a secretary and lived pretty quietly until there was sudden renewed interest in the sinking in the 1980s. Dean was the youngest survivor of the Titanic, as well as the last surviving passenger. She died in 2009 at the age of 97. Her ashes were scattered in Southampton at the same docks where the Titanic set sail. A horrifying accident, now an infamous tragedy with a haunting ending. The Titanic's captain uttered something rather ominous before the ship went down. When the Titanic struck an iceberg just after 11:30 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the impact felt like little more than a slight jarring to those aboard. Below deck, it was another story. The luxury passenger liner, which was the jewel of the British White Star Line helmed by Captain Edward John Smith, was on its maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City, when the partially submerged mountain of ice tore into the ship's hull about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. Thomas Andrews, Titanic's head designer, went below to assess the damage, and what he saw floored him. He ran to tell Captain Smith that seawater was pouring into the boiler room near the ship's bow, as well as in the room next door, because the iceberg punched through 6 watertight compartments. Captain Smith immediately understood this meant that the Titanic was doomed. Andrews believed that they had only 60 to 90 minutes before the ship would sink, so Smith began evacuating his ship. The crew members rounded up the women and children first, corralled them into the lifeboats, and prioritized first-class passengers. The captain, meanwhile, ordered the crew to send out distress signals and fire rockets. He still held out hope of rescue even as the lifeboats below hit the icy water. Captain Edward Smith, born on January 27, 1850, was a seasoned sailor who began his naval career as a teenager. He had been with the White Star Line for nearly 40 years. His crew respected him, and he was beloved by passengers, especially the ones in first class, even earning the title the Millionaire's Captain per Britannica. While the Titanic disaster was by far his worst accident at sea, it wasn't his first. On more than one occasion, his ships had run aground, and on September 20, 1911, Smith was captain of the White Star passenger liner Olympic when it collided with the Royal Navy cruiser Hawke near the Isle of Wight in the English Channel, causing extensive damage to both ships. The Royal Navy blamed the Olympic for the accident, and the ensuing legal defense, as well as repairs, were financially hard on the company. White Star backed their captain, who would contend that his record at sea was unblemished. According to Encyclopedia Titanica, Smith said, "When anyone asks me how I can best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. In all my experience, I've never been in any accident or any sort worth speaking about." However, as the clock ticked into the early morning hours of April 15, 1912, Smith must have realized that his tenure as a ship's captain was coming to an end.
Right ahead!
While the Titanic continued to sink, the wireless operators stayed at their stations, desperately trying to send out distress messages over their radio transmitters in any hope of rescue. Just after 2 a.m., Captain Smith came in and relieved them of their duties so they could attempt to save themselves. Below deck, the engineers stayed at their posts, attempting to pump the water out, which helped ensure the power stayed on for as long as possible. Even the ship's musicians stayed at their posts, playing music to calm the wildly panicked passengers. With no help left, Captain Smith apparently told his crew per the Mirror, "Well, boys, you've done your duty and done it well. I ask no more of you. I release you. You know the rule of the sea. It's every man for himself now, and God bless you." What happened next remains clouded in myth and mystery. Various sources allege that a rush of water swept Smith overboard, that he died by suicide, or that he jumped from the deck with a child in his arms whom he placed in one of the lifeboats. The version most historians seem to agree with comes from an eyewitness. Harold Bride, the surviving wireless operator, said that Smith dove into the sea from the bridge, per history. Smith, along with nearly 700 of the ship's crew members, died. The tragic fate of the Titanic instantly captured the public imagination in 1912, but the wreck wasn't discovered until decades after it sank. So who actually found it and how? The RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic around 11:30 p.m. on April 14, 1912. The evacuation process was slow and poorly organized, meaning that many were left behind when the ship finally sank around 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. Over 1,500 people died that night out of an estimated 2,240 people on board. Given all of the eyewitnesses, as well as the eventual presence of rescue ships, you'd think that it would be easy for investigators to find the wreckage, but it wasn't quite so simple. The Titanic kept drifting after transmitting its last known location, leaving investigators with a large search area that covered hundreds of miles. Finding a single ocean liner on the seafloor about 12,600 feet below the surface is no easy task, and anyone trying to recover the Titanic would have to put in some serious time, effort, and willpower to find her. Almost immediately after the Titanic sank, it seemed as if people were prepared to pull the wreck out of the Atlantic. This strange obsession didn't really dissipate as the decades wore on either. Many wanted to figure out where the ship was and, once it had been located, raise it from the seabed. But some of those proposals were notably odd. One British company suggested filling the ship with Vaseline contained in bags and allowing the hardened petroleum jelly to float the wreck to the surface. Others thought modified ping-pong balls might work. In the more immediate aftermath of the disaster, Denver architect Charles Smith came up with an idea that involved using a submarine and a bunch of magnets. Others seemed interested in balloon-based ideas, while some suggested using liquid nitrogen. However, given that no one had even found the wreck yet, these ideas remained highly theoretical. The Titanic went undiscovered for many decades after its sinking. Ultimately, professor and oceanographer Bob Ballard was the one who, along with his team, finally located the wreck in 1985. But he didn't find it on his first go. In fact, Ballard had already attempted to find the wreck in the 70s and came up with nothing. Still, if anyone was going to find the Titanic, it would likely have been someone like Ballard.
I boldly go where no one has gone before on planet Earth. You can't have a better job than that.
By the 1980s, he was already a respected scientist and explorer. He had served in the Navy before taking on a job with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Research Institution. As if that weren't enough, he also earned 2 doctorates in marine geology and geophysics, and designed a submersible, the Alvin, which was made to take humans far beneath the surface of the ocean. Prior to his legendary discovery, Ballard had already taken part in a number of scientific expeditions. One, for example, uncovered deep sea vents and proved that life in the deep could survive without sunlight. Yet he was always focused on finding the Titanic, often likening the wreck's discovery to his own personal Mount Everest. The harsh reality of many scientific expeditions is the need for money. Sure, explorers and researchers have plenty of passion, education, and dedication to go around, but it's often all for naught if their wallets are empty. After all, a ship needs fuel, a crew, equipment, and any manner of other supplies ready before it can even leave port. But for Bob Ballard, his 1985 trip to find the Titanic had a somewhat surprising and secretive funder. Blame it on the Cold War. Ballard had initially been approached by the U.S. military to find the wrecks of 2 submarines, the Scorpion and the Thresher, which also happened to be located in the North Atlantic. During the expedition, Ballard was technically placed back on duty as a Navy officer, though of course he wasn't able to disclose that at the time.
Guess what's in the middle? The Titanic. The only reason I found it was because of that fact that there was flanked by 2 nuclear submarines.
After finding the 2 nuclear vessels, he was essentially free to search for the Titanic, although he was only left with 12 days to do so. His eventual discovery of the Titanic even provided convenient cover for the mission during a tense period between US and Soviet relations. Nobody could have found a single shipwreck in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic without some assistance from technology. The group began its search with sonar. A system built by Jean-Louis Michel of the French National Institute of Oceanography was deployed to mow the lawn, meaning that the ship was tasked with making its way across the search area in regular strips, towing side-scan sonar equipment in order to get a glimpse of the ocean floor. After 31 days, they still hadn't found the Titanic, but had managed to eliminate a whopping 75% of the search area. Ballard's team then deployed an unmanned submersible with a camera known as the Argo. The group's theory relied on eyewitness accounts from the night of the sinking, which claimed the ship had broken in half as it went under. If the Titanic had indeed broken into two pieces, it would have left a considerable swath of bits and pieces scattered across the seafloor. Ballard believed that searching for the debris field would prove easier than searching for the ship itself, and it worked. After days of searching, Ballard's team found one of the Titanic's distinctive boilers lying on the seabed. The crew initially celebrated this momentous find, but then paused when they realized that it was nearly 2:20 in the morning, the same time at which the Titanic had sunk beneath the waves on April 15, 1912. Eventually, Ballard and his team also found some of the ship's hull plates. More and more detritus came into view over time, including dinnerware and furniture. Using the Argo to follow the trail of debris across the ocean floor, they eventually came across the bow of the long-lost Titanic. Eyewitness reports suggested that the Titanic had split in two during the sinking, but this wasn't necessarily a consensus opinion. A minority of survivors, including officers of the Titanic's White Star Line, claimed that the ship had sunk intact. However, it's possible that they were biased, since it wouldn't do the White Star Line much good to suggest that any of their other ships could have broken in half too. Many more testimonies failed to specify exactly in what shape the Titanic had been when it finally sank beneath the water. Frank Prentice, one survivor, remembered,
And all of a sudden she lifted up quickly and you could hear everything crashing through her. Everything that was movable was going through her.
Given the confusing evacuation, the dark night on which it had sunk, and the trauma felt by survivors of the disaster, it's no wonder that the details became confused. The two-piece theory was finally proven by Ballard's team, as the bow and stern were clearly separated by over 1,000 feet. But how did such a large ship break into two pieces that night in 1912? Well, it's all about physics. As the bow took on water, the stern began to lift, putting pressure on the ship. The pressure on the ship's riveted hull sections eventually caused the liner to break apart into two large sections. Unsurprisingly, the Titanic wasn't in fantastic shape when Ballard found it. The ship had, after all, split into two pieces and scattered debris across the seabed. What's more, it had been sitting there for decades, accumulating mud and rust. Nevertheless, the wreck was still undeniably the Titanic. Ballard's team was even able to identify features such as the location of the ship's famed Grand Staircase. Since the ship's rediscovery, multiple expeditions have been sent out to the location of the wreckage. As the years have gone on, the deterioration of the sunken liner has continued apace. The environment has not been kind to the ship, leading to buckling roofs and the collapse of the famous Crow's Nest, where lookout Frederick Fleet first saw the iceberg that took down the ship. In 2019, the first manned dive to the Titanic in 14 years found even more damage, with the famous captain's bathtub having already fallen through steadily weakening floors. What's more, bacteria that consume iron have produced rusticles, which, though now a visual hallmark of the wreck, are still striking evidence of the Titanic's steady deterioration. Little can really be done to halt the decay, though efforts to scan the wreck will hopefully produce 3D models that can remain long after the Titanic disappears forever. Though some prefer to call it salvage, Bob Ballard has stronger words for the idea that people might snatch up bits and pieces of the Titanic: looting. Given that the wreck is the final resting place of an estimated 1,500 people, many have also concluded that salvage operations amount to little more than grave robbing. Ballard has certainly spoken of the site with the sort of reverence reserved for grave sites, once saying, "It is a quiet and peaceful place, and a fitting place for the remains of this greatest of sea tragedies to rest. Forever may it remain that way."
And we're just now beginning to discover the pyramids of the deep, and I just hope that we go through that door of technology to appreciate and not to plunder.
Ballard says that he certainly understands the fascination that so many people have with the Titanic. The dream of finding and documenting the wreck is one that's been following him since he was young, after all. But in his words, it's being loved to death by visitors more than Mother Nature is attacking it. It's true that salvagers have been slowly picking apart the wreck. Some have obtained legitimate licenses to do so, while others have worked illegally. And it's very possible that while some artifacts may have fallen deeper into the wreck as the ship deteriorates, other pieces of the Titanic's history have been plucked up by those salvagers, meaning they're now sitting in somebody's private collection. Those who are especially worried about the prospect of people picking over the Titanic's remains will be glad to know that the ship now enjoys some measure of protection. In early 2020, the United States and the United Kingdom reached a joint agreement on managing the site of the sunken ocean liner. Technically, a treaty had been agreed upon in 2003, but it was never officially ratified after Canada and France appeared to give it the cold shoulder. The US was dragging its feet as well, but changed its mind in late 2019. Pre-existing UNESCO status established some rules, while the new treaty is set to expand upon some of the basic guidelines set out in 2012 by the United Nations. However, enforcing these treaties and rules gets a little tricky when you're out in the open ocean, and given how the Titanic can be vulnerable to even legitimate visitors and the forces of time and nature, it remains to be seen just how effective that protected status may be. What do you do after you accomplish one of your greatest dreams? you accomplish more. Indeed, Bob Ballard never stopped exploring, though he acknowledges that he'll probably always be remembered as one of the co-discoverers of the Titanic wreck. He believes that that is no excuse to rest on one's laurels. Not that having such a reputation is necessarily a bad thing, of course. As Ballard once told CNN, "In many ways, it has sort of freed me up to dream other dreams, so I feel emancipated in many ways." In the years since his achievement, Ballard estimates that he's found about 100 shipwrecks in total. In 2019, he even put in one of the more extensive efforts to find evidence of Amelia Earhart's fate. Earhart, a renowned aviator, disappeared during a round-the-world flight attempt in 1937. Some believe that she may have survived a plane crash and made it to Niku Mororo Atoll. Ballard and his team weren't able to find evidence of her plane around the atoll, but it was an illuminating expedition nonetheless, using advanced sonar technology to scour the nearby ocean floor. And as Ballard reminded everyone on his team, it's worth remembering that he had missed the Titanic by a mere 500 feet in one of his earliest expeditions.
The insane pressure at the bottom of the ocean will destroy just about anything. So why has the Titanic remained remarkably intact down there for over a century? The tragic destruction of the Ocean Gate's Titan exploration vessel in 2023 left folks with a lot of questions. Mainly, what exactly happened when the submersible lost contact with its support ship 1 hour and 45 minutes into its descent? Was there a structural defect in the Titan that led to its implosion? Was it human error?
I feel that this was such a preventable tragedy.
Not every vessel that sinks in the water implodes, though. The Titanic might be a decrepit, crumbling mass at this point, but it still has its original boat shape. And it's been sitting nearly 13,000 feet under the surface of the ocean since 1912. But the deeper underwater you go, the stronger the pressure gets. As Scientific American says, pressure increases at a rate of 15 pounds per square inch every 10 meters below the surface. That means for the first 10 meters down, the water pressure feels about the same as the air pressure when you're walking around on the beach. Below that, things start to feel really compressed really quickly. So what if a vessel is designed to be a perfectly airtight, self-contained bubble like a submarine, but still has some defect? It'll get instantly crushed from the outside. The Titanic, on the other hand, isn't a sealed vessel like the Titan was, and thus hasn't been affected by pressure in the same way. Water pressure is no joke. As Scientific American explains, the pressure felt when underwater comes from the water above you. And that's why things feel more compressed the deeper you go into the ocean. The entire mass of the ocean is sitting above your head. And down at the Titanic's depth, well, the pressure per square inch equals around 6,000. So no, you wouldn't survive for one fraction of a second down there unless protected in an airtight submersible shell. And yes, a submersible would crumple in an instant if it had the slightest defect or crack somewhere. Death would be instant. In fact, the pressure is so severe in the deepest depths of the ocean that folks have to rise slowly to avoid getting decompression sickness, also known as the bends. Harvard Medical School says that decompression sickness symptoms include joint pain, dizziness, numbness, and difficulty thinking. And when descending into the deep, the pressure inside a submersible needs to stay equal to the pressure on its surface. It needs to push out as much as the water pushes in.
You feel somewhat like you're on a totally different planet as you descend.
To better understand why the Titanic didn't crumple like a paper ball when it sank to the bottom of the ocean, we can look at a simple comparison. The Washington Post says that a car door has up to 600 pounds per square inch of pressure pushing on it from the outside if a car dives into the water. So if you fly off a pier, you'd have to be pretty strong in order to get the door of your car open. But that's only because of the difference in pressure between the inside and outside of the car. Open a window, and the pressure differential vanishes because water floods inside. The Titanic, on the other hand, sits at a depth subjected to 6,000 pounds per square inch. That's 10 times more than your hypothetical car door. Flat slabs of steel won't get squished down there like slices of bread. Neither will the railings in the deck or any objects inside. By the time the Titanic hit bottom, any pressure differentials across its hull or throughout its interior sections had long balanced out. Much of the current decay and decomposition we see across the Titanic comes not from water pressure, but from the exchange of oxygen molecules between metal and water. So for now, it seems the wreckage of the Titanic is safe, if anyone is willing to risk the journey.
The Titanic disaster wasn't just a terrible loss of life, it also robbed the world of all the great things the victims could have done if they lived. Immortalized in books, films, and legend, here are some of the Titanic victims that could have changed the world. You know you've made something of your life when the President of the United States not only gives your eulogy, but describes you as a younger brother. President William Howard Taft wrote that once he heard about the Titanic disaster, he knew that his old friend had been lost, because there was no way Major Archibald Butt would do anything other than remain on deck and help others around him. Butt wasn't just one of Taft's military aides. He had served as the personal aide to President Theodore Roosevelt, too. Taft's first term was coming to an end in 1912, and Roosevelt decided to run against him in the presidential election. Caught between his two bosses, Butt became extremely stressed out, so Taft ordered him to take a vacation. Butt was on the last leg of a 6-week European trip when he set off on the ill-fated Titanic. According to one witness, he was last seen in the smoking room with his good friend Francis Millet. Other witnesses claimed he took charge of the ship's evacuation, personally helping women into the lifeboats. The truth is unknown, though, and his remains were never recovered. Today, the name Guggenheim is more closely associated with art museums than with their original endeavors, such as mining. Meyer Guggenheim, a Swiss immigrant who first bought 2 Colorado copper mines in the 1880s, built a mining empire from the ground up and passed it on to his sons. One of those sons, Benjamin, was working full-time in the family business by the time he was 20, and he later helped develop and found the International Steam Pump Company. He died on Titanic only a few years later through a fluke of fate. Originally scheduled to return to the U.S. on the Lusitania, he was first given the option to take Lusitania's replacement ship, the Carmania. Instead, he opted to be a part of history and take Titanic's maiden voyage. Guggenheim certainly became a part of history, though not in the way he intended. He was immortalized as part of Titanic legend when he and his valet dressed in their finest and declared they were spending their final hours as they had lived, like gentlemen.
These are for you, Mr. Guggenheim. Oh, thank you. We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down as gentlemen.
One of his daughters, Peggy Guggenheim, became the driving force behind Venice's Guggenheim Art Museum, while Benjamin's will left the equivalent of $3 million in today's money to charity. Daniel Warner Marvin was only 18 years old when he died aboard Titanic, but he had already set his sights on becoming an engineer and contributing to his family's film legacy. His father was the co-founder of the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, one of the early pioneers in filmmaking, and Marvin was on his way to becoming an engineer in his own right. Marvin's wedding was one of the first ever filmed with the new camera technology they had built. He and his young bride were returning to the States after a 3-week honeymoon when the Titanic sank. After carrying his pregnant wife to the lifeboats, he reportedly told her, quote, "It's all right, little girl, you go, I'll stay." Marvin's daughter was born a few months later, and his widow destroyed almost all the footage of their wedding. His family's company? They're still going, now known as Biograph. John Jacob Astor IV was the scandalous and controversial heir to the Astor family, and if the only thing you're really familiar with is his building the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, that's a shame. His great-grandfather arrived in America carrying just $25 and a few flutes his brother had made by hand. By the time he died, he was one of the richest and most famous men in the country. The elder Astor built on his fortune by investing in New York real estate, and that's where John Jacob Astor IV comes in. Not only was he responsible for part of the Waldorf Astoria and several other landmark hotels in the area, he was also a pretty brilliant jack of all trades. He wrote science fiction novels, acted in plays, invented things like wind turbine engines, and at the time of his death was the richest man in the world. Just how much he was worth is tough to pin down, but one estimate suggests that he had the equivalent of $58.7 billion in today's money. The scandalous and controversial part happened when Astor IV divorced his first wife and married another woman who was a year younger than his own son. They decided to go to Europe to get away from the resulting media scandal and unfortunately chose to return home on Titanic.
Don't make me leave you.
Nonsense, I'll be on a later boat.
His young wife, Madeline, survived to give birth to their son, who she named John Jacob Astor VI. Astor's body was recovered on April 22nd and buried in New York. Every so often, you read about someone who makes you believe in the better things in life again, like true love, decency, and self-sacrifice. That's the story of Isidore and Ida Strauss, who were immortalized in one of the most memorable scenes of the 1997 hit Titanic. The couple wasn't just incredibly wealthy, they were major charitable donors who gave away a huge amount of their fortune to causes across their adopted city of New York. Perhaps it's because they remembered what it was like to have nothing. After immigrating from Germany to Georgia, Isidore's family had to declare bankruptcy during the Civil War. After paying off their debts, they moved to New York City and started over. Isidore worked his way up, eventually buying Macy's and becoming a congressman. Isidore and Ida were also famous for their benevolent treatment of their employees, taking a personal interest in their lives and well-being, and offering benefits that are generous even by today's standards. In turn, the couple had dedicated employees who were moved to tears with the news of their deaths on the Titanic. Ida famously had a place in the lifeboats, but she refused to leave her husband and chose to die at his side, giving her place to her maid. While Ida's body was never recovered, Isidore's body was. He was buried amid tributes and mourning that moved the whole city, with songs and memorials dedicated to their memory.
Where you go, I go. Don't argue with me, Isidore. You know it does no good.
A metallurgist who was also an African explorer, Henry Forbes Julian was one of the first Europeans to see the Victoria Falls. He also traveled extensively through Mexico and Europe, documenting archaeological artifacts in previously unexplored territory, all while doing what he went there to do, pioneering new techniques in metallurgy and mining. During his travels, he made the trip across the Atlantic at least 13 times. By the time he got on the Titanic, the crossing was fairly every day for him. Still, despite being a bit jaded by the whole thing, he wrote to his wife that he was reluctantly impressed by the luxury offered on the massive ship. Sadly, his body was never found after the sinking. Quig Edmund Baxter spent his post-school years playing football and then hockey for the Montreal Shamrocks Hockey Club. Hockey being what hockey is, he only lasted a single season before getting hit in the face with a stick so hard he lost half his eyesight. Hockey players being as badass as hockey players are, he started coaching and playing amateur hockey in Europe instead of retiring like a sane person. Baxter ended up being one of the driving forces behind organizing the first international hockey tournament in Paris, and was on his way back home when he boarded the Titanic. As he was perhaps the most typically Canadian hockey player ever, he had not only his mother and sister with him, but also his lover, a 24-year-old cabaret singer named Bertha Anthony Meni, who was traveling under an assumed name. When he got his mother, sister, and would-be bride safely onto the lifeboats, he handed over a silver flask and sent them on their way. His body was never recovered. There's nothing about the life and accomplishments of W.T. Stead that isn't amazing, starting with how he could read both Latin and English when he was 5 years old. Oh, and he almost single-handedly pioneered the idea of investigative journalism. The son of a minister, he took his steadfast morals to the streets and, more importantly, to the pages of London newspapers. In 1885, he rocked polite London society with a 4-part series called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, where he exposed London's seedy underbelly and its world of human trafficking. Not content just to repeat what he'd heard, Stead went undercover to purchase another human, then published all the details of just how easy it was and who was involved. He was actually arrested and imprisoned after the story ran, but his work ultimately led to a change in English law. Stead believed that journalism should have an end goal, and that wasn't just about bringing news to the masses. It was for inciting people to change the world for the better, a tool for social reform, and a way for people to shape their own government, calling out injustice and unfairness when they saw it. His work had such a large-scale impact that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize more than once, and word on the street was that he was going to win it in 1912. That was, of course, the year he died on the Titanic, and his body, like so many others, was never found. There's a strange postscript, however. In death, he managed to somehow become even more famous than he was in life because of a pair of stories he wrote decades earlier that seemed to predict the Titanic disaster. In one, a ship sinks in the Atlantic with great loss of life because there aren't enough lifeboats. In the other, a handful of survivors are rescued from the ocean after their ship strikes an iceberg and sinks. Francis Millet started out as a drummer boy and surgeon's assistant in the Civil War, and later became a reporter and editor for the Boston Courier. It was his skill as an artist that got him the most recognition, though, and by the time he devoted himself full-time to his artistic career, he was winning awards and recognition across Europe. Even as he acted as a war correspondent in the Russo-Turkish and Spanish-American Wars, he painted, observed, wrote, and collected. That experience, along with the countless artifacts he brought home with him, led to him creating some of the most detailed and accurate murals and paintings of the time. His work is in London's Tate Gallery and New York City's Met, along with government buildings and churches across the country. His research notes, writings, and stories are in a collection in the Smithsonian, along with clothing and other artifacts he amassed during his travels to the Orient, Alaska, and Hannibal. He helped found Boston School of the Museum of Fine Arts, and he was working as the head of a fine arts school in Rome when he was headed to New York aboard Titanic. Millet wrote perhaps the most scathing description of the ship's passengers in a letter to a friend, saying in part, "There are a number of obnoxious, ostentatious American women, the scourge of any place they invest, and worse on shipboard than anywhere." His remains were later recovered, and he shares a memorial with his good friend Major Archibald Butt. You've heard of Agatha Christie, right? Jacques Frutel's work is often credited with being her inspiration. Before he died aboard Titanic, he wrote more than 40 stories about a detective called Professor Augustus SFX Van Dusen, who, like Sherlock Holmes, was renowned for thinking around corners and unraveling even the most bizarre of mysteries. Futrell already had massive success stateside, and in 1912, he and his wife headed to Europe to negotiate the European release of his work. While there, they also signed a handful of contracts that would make any writer today willing to sell their soul. The contracts were worth thousands, and in order to celebrate his newfound global success, they booked passage back home on the most luxurious ship they could find, Titanic. As the Titanic was sinking, Futrell's wife got into one of the lifeboats, only leaving him because he promised to get into the next one. He never did, however, and witness reports say he was last seen standing on the deck with John Jacob Astor IV. After his death, his wife released his final novel, My Lady's Garter, posthumously. On April 15, 1912, the unsinkable Titanic fell to the ocean floor. Today, hundreds of recovered objects tell the story of that tragic night and the souls that were lost to the sea. Here are 13 of the most fascinating. Sitting on the ocean floor, 12,500 feet below the surface, the Titanic is very fragile. The metal of the ship itself is being eaten away by deep-sea bacteria that leave behind crumbling rusticles.
Stalactites of rust dangle from the ship. So fragile, they crumble into a cloud of dust if disturbed.
This makes the idea of raising the whole ship little more than a fantasy. But pieces of the ship have made it to the surface. In 1998, salvage company RMS Titanic Incorporated pulled up a 15-ton section of the wreck covered with debris and sea life. An attempt 2 years earlier failed when a cable snapped mid-recovery. RMS Titanic Incorporated was granted sole rights to draw artifacts from the wreck site in 1994, but was required to stabilize them and forbidden from selling anything. As a result, the Big Piece, as it became known, was cleaned and covered with a protective coating before it went on exhibit in Las Vegas. Today, it's on display in Titanic, the Artifact Exhibition at the Luxor Hotel and Casino. The first-class plates and teacups recovered from the wreckage of the Titanic are beautiful, made from fine china and decorated with gold and expensive blue cobalt. It's easy to imagine a fancy lady and her industrialist husband dining off of these. Second-class passengers aboard the Titanic were also doing all right in the world. However, once cleaned of the deep-water muck, the second-class plates salvaged from the wreck are far less ornate. Their blue floral pattern is nice, to be sure, but doesn't compare to the delicate beauty of the first-class set. Third-class passengers and crew members had no illusions about their place in the Titanic hierarchy. They too ate off dedicated plates, but these were far from the fine hand-painted dinnerware of first-class passengers. Plates salvaged from the Titanic reveal that third-class passengers and crew were served on simple white sets stamped with the red logo of the White Star Line. The menu for the final first-class meal served aboard the Titanic on April 14, 1912 survived in the purse of Ruth Dodge, wife of California banker Dr. Washington Dodge. Dr. Dodge had been receiving medical treatment in France, and a small family was returning to America aboard the liner. The Dodges would have been able to pick from a vast array of foods for their luncheon. These included fussy Edwardian options like eggs argenteuil, which came with delicate asparagus tips and bologna sausage. Hopefully, someone was availing themselves of the extensive selection of cheese and a nice tankard of Munich lager, as, unbeknownst to them, it would have been their last chance to indulge before the tragedy. Ruth, Washington, and their 4-year-old son Washington Dodge Jr. all survived the sinking. One of the most iconic images of the Titanic tragedy is the ship's band standing on deck, playing tunes like the hymn Nearer My God to Thee to keep everyone calm. Titanic survivors confirmed that the band played nearly to the end, though some remembered them playing a more cheerful waltz or newfangled ragtime to keep spirits up.
Till the end I heard them play, Nearer My God to Thee.
Wallace Hartley played violin in the band and his instrument survived. It was given to Hartley by his fiancée, Mariah Robinson, who watched her husband-to-be set off for a gig on the Titanic ahead of their June 1914 wedding. Hartley died in the shipwreck, but his body was recovered. An inventory of the effects found with him doesn't include the violin, though Robinson later wrote that she was grateful to have received it. After Robinson died in 1939, the instrument went through a series of owners until it was found in an attic in 2004. Testing confirmed that it was indeed Hartley's violin. Seawater had left salt deposits and 2 significant cracks in the body of the instrument. On October 19, 2013, it was auctioned for £900,000 to a private owner. Adjusted for inflation to 2023 values, the violin sold for the equivalent of more than $1.2 million. In 1987, salvagers brought up a rose gold, silver, and diamond bracelet bearing the name Amy. The leather bag it was found in protected it from seawater as well as the microorganisms that devoured other Titanic relics.
The natural process of tanning a leather creates an antibacterial situation so it prevents deterioration.
But who was Amy? It wasn't a common name at the time, at least amongst Titanic passengers. Records indicate that there were only 2 women by that name on the voyage, although it could have been a nickname for another passenger with a similar name. In Titanic, Women and Children First, author Judith Geller theorizes that the bracelet's owner may have been Amy Stanley, a third-class passenger who survived the sinking. However, it would be an oddly fine bit of jewelry for someone with a low-cost ticket, and Stanley isn't known to have mentioned a lost diamond bracelet. To date, no one has been able to definitively identify the mysterious bracelet-bearing Amy. The environment in which the Titanic currently lies is subject to strong deep water currents and microbes that consume metal. So it's remarkable that several delicate glass perfume vials survived the trip from the ocean's surface to the sea floor and back up again. In the summer of 2000, a salvage crew recovered a small leather pouch from the wreck. When they brought the bag into a shipboard laboratory, they smelled floral perfume. They eventually found 3 bags containing perfume samples in the wreckage. The satchels were labeled with the name of Adolf Saalfeld, a German Jewish perfumer. Saalfeld, a first-class passenger, was carrying 65 vials of sample scents intended for American clients. Saalfeld survived, but his product went down with the ship. They have a second life, however. The surviving scents formed the basis for the Titanic Legacy 1912 fragrance sold on QVC. In 2017, a waterlogged letter sold for £126,000, or the equivalent of $160,000. Of course, this was no ordinary bit of mail. Not only had the letter in question come from the Titanic, but remarkably, someone managed to fish the still legible document from the ocean and eventually delivered it to its intended recipient. The actual content of the letter, dated just a day before the disaster, isn't especially interesting. The writer, Alexander Oscar Holverson, was a businessman traveling home to New York with his wife Mary. Writing to his mother, Holverson commented on the grand size of the ship.
He wrote, "If all goes well, we will arrive in New York on Wednesday."
He also noted that the immensely rich John Jacob Astor IV deigned to sit on the deck just like normal folk, at least the ones who could spring for a first-class ticket. Astor and Holverson both died in the disaster, but their wives survived.
The whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful.
When Holverson's remains were recovered, the letter was found on his body. Even though it lacked postage and was damaged by seawater, it was delivered to his mother. Though it may not be the most glamorous item recovered from the Titanic wreck, one of the doomed ship's deck bells still carries plenty of historic weight. This humble bronze bell was part of the lookout station on the forward part of the ship. This is where lookout Frederick Fleet would have first spotted the iceberg that would so critically damage the Titanic. He rang the bell 3 times to alert the bridge crew of the looming danger, though calm waters and a dark moonless night meant that Fleet didn't spot the iceberg until it was dangerously close. The bell and Fleet's shout of "iceberg" right ahead couldn't avert disaster.
When you're traveling at 21 or 22 knots and you see iceberg dead ahead, there wasn't enough time to turn.
Fleet survived the Titanic sinking and lived until 1965. His bell, however, went down with the ship until it was recovered in the late 1980s. The Titanic's grand staircase is the stuff of legend. It features prominently in director James Cameron's 1997 mega-hit film Titanic, and a recreation of the grand staircase has pride of place in the Titanic The Artifact exhibition installation in Las Vegas. But we don't know what the grand staircase really looked like. Surviving photos are actually of the staircase from Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. Given the design similarities between the two vessels, it's probably close enough. It certainly was for Cameron, who used the Olympic photos for his movie's set design. Yet, given that the grand staircase was either damaged during the sinking or collapsed into ruin at the shipwreck site, we can't say whether Cameron and his team got it right. But there are pieces of the grand staircase that may have survived. Salvagers recovered a bronze cherub statue like one that would have adorned a first-class staircase, though some researchers suggest that this particular figure came from another, smaller stairway. This carving may bear the marks of the ship's harrowing descent, as its missing left foot may have popped off when the statue was wrenched from its post. As a milliner, Marion meanwhile must have understood fashion. Sure, she was a third-class passenger on the Titanic, but making hats was her business. She may have intended to continue that work in the United States, given the stylish alligator skin bag she was carrying, which included a reference noting that Meanwell always paid her rent on time. Unfortunately, she didn't survive the sinking. However, many decades later, salvagers recovered her still intact alligator purse from the Titanic debris field. When they opened it, they discovered not only the landlord's endorsement, but also her marriage license. These fragile documents survived in part because the damaged ship and its contents settled in the deep, dark ocean far from light or oxygen. Meanwhil's high-quality bag made of thick hide also helped preserve its contents. Recovered from the wreck site shortly after the liner went down, this unassuming key carries a tag reading Locker 14F Deck. It was found on the remains of Sidney Sedunnery, a young third-class steward, and indicates that Sedunnery would have been on the F deck at some point on the night of the Titanic disaster. Auctioneer Andrew Aldridge went so far as to call Sedunnery a hero, telling the BBC that, "Without a doubt, he saved lives. Here's a man who sacrificed his life to save others." Although there is no eyewitness testimony to any particular acts of heroism on Sedunnery's part, there's no denying that this small locker key is a part of history. In 2016, the key sold for a staggering £85,000. Adjusted for inflation, that comes out to about $140,889 in 2023. Though there's scant evidence that sturdy suitcases or well-traveled valises did much to help people in a practical sense on the night of the sinking, these everyday objects have done much to preserve the history of the Titanic and the people who booked passage on it. Take the suitcase of William Henry Allen, which helped to preserve quite a few of his personal effects, even though Allen, a toolmaker, died in the sinking. Allen was quite stylish, owner of a polka dot scarf and leather dress boots. His suitcase also preserved about 150 documents, though the luggage had been submerged for many years. Inside the suitcase, salvagers also found a wool vest owned by Allen, with its buttons still in place despite passing through about 2.5 miles of icy ocean water to the ocean floor. In 1987, salvagers brought up a leather bag full of jewelry from the wreck site. The night of the sinking, the bag was almost certainly one of many such containers under the protection of the ship's pursers, crew members who were in charge of handling money and safekeeping passengers' valuables. Pursers worked to place the bags on lifeboats, but clearly they didn't all make it to shore in 1912. A century later, the jewels in this particular bag were part of a glittering exhibit of Titanic valuables. They include a unique necklace made with gold nuggets. No one is sure who it belonged to, but speculation has landed on Margaret Brown, otherwise known as the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Here comes that vulgar brown woman. Quickly get up before she sits with us.
Besides being the child of working-class immigrants who made it as a socialite and philanthropist, she was the wife of mining magnate J.J. Brown, who could have given her the necklace. The wreck of the Titanic is so dangerous that it's even claiming lives today, but how many people have risked it all to visit the ship's watery grave? When the Titanic set off on its maiden voyage in 1912, no one on board could have imagined the legacy the ship would leave behind. The Titanic struck an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland and sank on April 15, 1912. 1,503 people lost their lives. Only 706 survived. The breakdown of deaths among class, gender, and crew type is both telling and disturbing. 61% of first-class passengers survived, while 25% of third-class passengers survived. 20% of male passengers survived, while 75% of female passengers survived. Those who did make it, of course, were left thoroughly traumatized by the sinking.
I should probably dream of that tonight. Have another nightmare. You'd think I'm too old for that, but you'd be amazed.
All in all, given the scope and drama behind the event, it's no wonder that the sinking of the Titanic continues to capture the imagination. For a long time, the nature of the Titanic's sinking remains something of a mystery. The ship's wreckage wasn't even discovered until 1985, 73 years after it sank, as part of a secret U.S. Navy mission. Since then, explorers, researchers, the curious, and the wealthy have ventured out to the Titanic to try and learn more. In 2023, a company called Magellan Limited rendered the whole wreckage in a 16-terabyte 3D model. That mission deployed 2 submersibles with manned crews. Those individuals joined the roster of fewer than 250 total people who have visited the wreckage. The first person to visit the Titanic after it sank was Robert Ballard, an oceanographer at the University of Rhode Island and National Geographic Society explorer in residence. In the 1980s, Ballard approached the U.S. Navy with a proposal to build a robotic submersible capable of embarking on the mission to discover the Titanic. The Navy was interested in the technology involved in the venture and agreed, and in 1985, Ballard got lucky on his voyage. By following a trail of heaviest to lightest debris broken off from the Titanic as it was sinking, he was able to trace a path to the wreckage. He got the coordinates of the ship at a staggering 13,000 feet deep and 400 nautical miles off the coast of Newfoundland. In the years since, others have followed in his wake. Most visitors to the wreck have been either researchers or those connected with expedition companies, and they don't go often. EOS Expeditions visited the Titanic in 2019, a full 14 years after the last time anyone had visited. Previous to that, in 2000, reporter and physicist Michael Guillen visited the craft, took some notable pictures, and barely made it out alive after a collision with one of the Titanic's propellers. And then, of course, there's James Cameron, whose 1997 film Titanic permanently cemented the tragedy of the ship sinking in public imagination. Cameron's all-consuming preoccupation with the Titanic led him to dive down to the wreckage a grand total of 33 times. On June 17, 2023, a submersible from OceanGate Expeditions spearheaded a particularly infamous journey down to the sunken Titanic. The submersible Titan vanished on Sunday, June 18th. In the aftermath of the disaster, it became clear that this Titanic expedition was unlike most of the others. In an interview for the marine tech company Teledyne Marine, OceanGate founder Stockton Rush said that he didn't hire older, more experienced men to work at the company because they weren't, in his words, inspirational. By contrast, he glibly said of the Titan submersible that anybody can drive it, with the help of its now infamous video game controller. Rush was piloting the vessel at the time of its destruction. The other 4 passengers included a Pakistani father and his 19-year-old son, a British businessman and adventurer, and a French Titanic expert. OceanGate's doomed mission was one of a string of Titanic tourism expeditions they had set up. Each person on board the Titan paid $250,000 for the journey. Mike Reese, who took part in last year's underwater tour of the Titanic, told CNN that he knew he was risking his life by diving down 13,000 feet below the waves. Captain Edward John Smith played a pivotal role in the tragic legend of the RMS Titanic, but what happened to the daughter he left behind? Some 1,500 passengers and crew members died when in 1912 the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank. No doubt that fateful night left its scars on those who were there.
I should probably dream of that tonight. Have another nightmare.
Tragedies of that scale affect more than just the victims and the survivors, however. Many on board that fateful night had family back home or loved ones awaiting them at their destination. Among them was Captain Edward John Smith of the Titanic, who died during the sinking. Captain Smith was married to Sarah Eleanor Smith when the infamous maritime tragedy happened, and the couple had just one daughter, Helen Melville Smith, who went by Mel. Mel would go on to suffer many more tragedies beyond the sinking of her father's ship. On a sunny July day in 1914, though, all that lay ahead. On that day, Mel was in her native England to unveil a new statue of her father, Captain Smith. By that time, Smith was hailed as a hero for his actions during the Titanic sinking a little more than 2 years earlier. Smith's teenage daughter declared the statue unveiled as the large bronze figure of the bearded seaman was revealed. Captain Edward Smith had nearly missed the birth of his only child on April 2, 1898. While his wife Eleanor was pregnant, he made multiple trips back and forth across the Atlantic aboard the White Star Line passenger ship RMS Majestic. All the while, he continued to rise through the ranks. Mel Smith was born in Liverpool, and luckily Captain Smith managed to be there for the event. Although he was often at sea, he adored his daughter, spoiling her when home and giving her several pet names including Babs and Gilly. He wrote to her often when traveling, too. One letter touchingly reveals the depth of the sea captain's affection for his daughter. Smith wrote alongside a bird illustration, "I could not catch a bunny to send you on my letter, so send you this card by this little bird." Mel was nearly 14 when her father's new ship, the Titanic, set sail on its maiden voyage. She would never see her father again. Various survivors offered several accounts of what befell the captain as his ship sank into the icy North Atlantic in the early morning of April 15. One crewman, for example, recalled seeing Smith swept off the deck before swimming back and going down with his ship. The loss of her father at such a young age turned out to be just the first of many tragedies that befell Mel Smith. On April 26, 1931, Mel's mother and Captain Smith's widowed wife was crossing a rain-soaked London street with her umbrella blocking her view. A cab struck her, and the 69-year-old died from a fractured skull 2 days later. By that time, Mel had already lost 2 husbands. Her first, Captain John Gilbertson of the British Merchant Marines, died of a tropical disease. Her next husband, a stockbroker named Sidney Russell Cook, died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Cook and Mel's children also died young. Simon died in 1944 when he was 20 while serving with the Royal Air Force during World War II. Priscilla died of complications from polio in 1947. By the time of Mel's death, the Titanic disaster had already become the stuff of legend. It had even been the subject of Hollywood movies such as 1958's A Night to Remember. In that movie, actor Lawrence Naismith portrayed Mel's father. She reportedly approved of Naismith's performance as the ill-fated sea captain. Famously, Captain Smith would later be played by Bernard Hill in James Cameron's 1997 epic Titanic. Sadly, when Mel died in 1973, she left behind no children, essentially putting an end to her and Captain Smith's genetic line.
The Titanic shipwreck is perhaps the most enduring ocean disaster to date, still captivating millions around the globe, more than 111 years later. But there's more to the site than just wreckage and debris. Entire museums have been established to showcase Titanic relics found deep in the North Atlantic Ocean, including clothes, pocket watches, chandeliers, and even a menu of the crew's last meal. The Titanic Belfast Museum in Northern Ireland has captivated more than 5.3 million visitors between 2013 and 2021.
You know, it's not a museum, it's an active, interactive adventure.
And while the story of the unsinkable ship striking an iceberg still resonates with the public, scientists have actually been obsessing over something much less understood. Near the Titanic shipwreck lies a mystery that baffled the scientific community when it was discovered in 1998. In 2022, they finally discovered the truth. Science Alert reports that underwater research director Paul-Henri Nargeolet was the first to capture the perplexing sonar blip that would go on to spark controversy for almost 25 years. Paul-Henri has since died on OceanGate's Titan submersible, which imploded in June 2023 on a deep-sea expedition to view the remains of the Titanic. He discovered the blip during one of his 30 deep-sea dives exploring the Titanic's ruins. When Nargeolet's team first touched down in 1998 to make the recording, the scientific community didn't know what conclusion to draw. For the nearly 2.5 decades that followed, several theories were proposed, but none solidified. So what was lying there 9,500 feet beneath the surface of the North Atlantic? Could the mysterious blip seen on the scanner denote an odd geological feature? Or a large and looming object poking through the murky waters? In an October 2022 press release, Narjolet wrote, "On the sonar, this could have been any number of things, including the potential of it being another shipwreck. I've been seeking the chance to explore this large object that appeared on sonar so long ago. It turns out that the blip was caused by a thriving, newly discovered ocean environment, an unexpected volcanic formation complete with a teeming ecosystem. Deep in the North Atlantic lies this natural coral reef, ripe with diversity and inclusive of multiple maritime creatures." In a press release, OceanGate chief scientist Dr. Steve W. Ross wrote, "We are astonished at the diversity and density of the sponges, bamboo corals, other cold-water corals, squat lobsters, and fishes that are thriving at 2,900 meters deep in the North Atlantic Ocean. This underwater ecosystem is located just 25 miles from the Titanic shipwreck, which became a kind of artificial reef. Now that this new volcanic formation has been discovered, questions are erupting in the world of science. How does this natural reef compare to the life forms swimming around the artificial reef of the Titanic's wreckage? How are the sponges and coral surviving? Are there any new species in the reef?" Science Alert reports that these are some of the top questions researchers want to get to the bottom of, and they have already set out to do just that. This new discovery is not only a fascinating glimpse into the hidden wonders of the deep sea, but also a potential source of insight into how marine life responds to environmental changes. When you think about climate change, you might not automatically conjure up imagery from sunken shipwrecks like the Titanic. However, Science Alert reports that this new discovery could clue scientists in on how delicate ecosystems, like the one identified near the Titanic, adapt to the warming waters and rising seas. On July 23, 2022, Narjolet led his team of eager researchers 9,514 feet deep to discover the flourishing natural reef. But this is all just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Now that the world knows the reef exists, the information can be used to learn more about survival in deep-sea environments. In an October 2022 press release from OceanGate, marine biologist Murray Roberts wrote, "We need to share this information with the scientific community and policymakers to be sure these vulnerable ecosystems get the proper attention and protection they deserve." After the devastating loss of the Titan, however, it's highly doubtful that OceanGate will be leading that charge.
The sinking of the Titanic left them alone in the world, or so everyone thought. The so-called Titanic orphans actually had a mother who managed to find them after the ship sank. Here's how. As Leonardo DiCaprio fans know all too well, the tragedy of the Titanic was a tale of terrible class inequality. First-class passengers had a much higher chance of getting a spot on the lifeboats than second- and third-class passengers. Most of the people who died in the Atlantic's icy waters on April 15, 1912 were third-class travelers. More than three-quarters of the 709 third-class passengers died, while 58% of second-class passengers and just 39% of first-class passengers perished.
You can't keep us locked in here like animals. The ship's bloody sinking!
Two second-class survivors became media sensations because of their unusual backstory. They were 2 and 4 years old and had lost their father in the disaster. Their father had kidnapped them from their mother and registered them under false identities when they boarded the ship. They were listed as Louis and Lola, but the press called them the Titanic Orphans since they were the only children who survived without a parent or guardian. The authorities had to figure out who they were and whether they had any surviving family. Their father, Michel Navratil, was a Slovakian tailor who lived in Nice, France. He decided to take his 2 young boys, Michel Jr. and Edmond, to America without telling his estranged wife, Marcel, who had custody but had let them visit him over Easter. He and the boys were sleeping when the ship struck an iceberg near Newfoundland. According to the 2019 documentary Titanic: Stories from the Deep, Michel Jr. recalled years later in a letter, "I was woken up by my father. He carried me in his arms to the deck of the Titanic. My brother and I were put in a boat that was already almost full of passengers. It was the last lifeboat to escape. A 19-year-old first-class passenger, Margaret Hayes, wrapped her dog in her cloak and heard someone yelling as the boat was being lowered, as reported in a 1912 article in the Daybook. A man called out and handed his 2 children to a sailor. Michel Jr. wrote, "My father charged me to give my mother his affection, and he left us." Hayes took care of the children. When they were rescued by the Carpathia, the authorities struggled to identify them. The 2 young survivors spoke only French and answered "oui" to everything they were asked. Michel Jr. and Edmond stayed with Hayes in Manhattan while the authorities searched for anyone who might know them. Meanwhile, in France, Marcel Navratil saw their photo in the paper and was overjoyed. They weren't Louis and Lola, but Michel and Edmond, her boys who had been taken from her by their father. Marcel went to New York, confirmed that she was the boys' mother, and took them back home to France on the ship Oceanic. According to the daybook, she told reporters, "I am the happiest mother in the world." Hayes kissed them goodbye, and both boys grew to adulthood. Edmund was an architect who joined the French resistance during World War II and became a Nazi prisoner of war. He died in his 40s in 1953 after his health suffered during his imprisonment. Michel Jr. was a professor of philosophy at Montpellier University. He visited the US for the Titanic's 75th anniversary and a few years later saw his father's grave in Canada for the first time. His father's body had been recovered and buried in Halifax. Michel Jr. died in 2001 at age 92. According to the nonprofit Encyclopedia Titanica, he once said in an interview, "There were vast differences of people's wealth on the ship, and I realized later that if we hadn't been in second class, we'd have died. The people who came out alive often cheated and were aggressive. The honest didn't stand a chance."